morning, everyone. How are you? We sincerely hope that you're having, there's Dali. Dali's sitting in France. I'm Linda. I'm sitting in Benoni. Not nearly as romantic as France, but maybe a little warmer, eh, Dali?
No, definitely so, definitely so. Yeah, very chilly here by us, but yeah, the season is turning, so at least that's positive. It's getting, the days are becoming a bit longer again, so that's good.
Yeah. Okay, so just by the way, we are from Food Focus. In case you hadn't, in case you wondered whether you had stumbled upon the wrong webinar, you haven't. You are in the right place, and this is food safety fundamentals. So the important thing is to have some fun on a Friday and to also talk about some serious stuff in relation to food safety. And so for today's topic, we are going to be chatting about the new SANS 10330 and the 2020 version. And so I hope you've got lots of questions, because the important thing about food safety fundamentals is that we don't do the work. You do the work, because we want to just have a conversation. So I have my Food Focus mug, and it is full of coffee. So I hope you have yours and that you are ready to enjoy today's presentation. So Del, I'm just going to see, who do we have with us on the line before we get stuck into the presentation. Oh, Michelle, it's so good to have you. And there's a few Michelles. Michelle Bosch, I'm referring to. It's so cool to have you. Thank you for being with us today. I definitely recognize that name. Renola, it's so nice to see you. How are you? It's lovely that you are joining us today. And our Jess is one of our sort of groupies. Jess, we love having you around. Next week, you're running the fundamentals session. So just so that, you know, it's a bit of a heads up in that regard. Okay, so there's a great group of us today, and we're very happy to have you. And we had 45 people register for today, but maybe not everyone can join us, so hopefully they will join us a little bit later, and or they'll definitely pick up on the recording. So make sure you behave yourself, because obviously on the recording we want to make a good impression, all of us, not just you know, Food Focus. All right, so for those of you that didn't join us for the launch, just a bit of an update in terms of why we're doing these things. We know that you're all zoomed out and you're having so many of these sessions anyway, but this is really just such a convenient way to have a chat. And that's the difference between a formal webinar and food safety fundamentals, because on the Friday we need to have some fun to start the weekend, but we're still food safety practitioners, and so how can we combine the two? The second thing that is very important about this type of conversation is that we will be unmuting you at the end of the session. So normally on webinars, we allow you to send through your questions, but we'd actually like to hear from you. So don't run away or get shy when we get to the end, because this is really about having a conversation and speaking to a real live human being, as Adele puts it, when it comes to food safety.
Okay, so seeing and hugging.
I know.
But this is the second best, so we'll have to do this then.
Yeah. At least you get to see the Eiffel Tower a lot more than we do.
True.
All right. So without further ado, I'm going to start a presentation. So I have a few slides that I will definitely share with you. The intention is to run through the standard and to then talk about what some of the very important requirements are within this new 10330 version. I also just want to give you a bit of a background, and then we'll have an opportunity to ask whatever questions you have, and hopefully we'll be able to get through that in the time that we have. Okay, so here we go. I have to be able to see, remember? So let's go through the presentation. Moenie vir my lag, Dali, just be lekker nie. Okay, dokes. All right, so hopefully you can hear me. No one's put up their hands at this point in time, so hopefully you can hear me. You are allowed to use the chat button. So please, you've got it looks a bit like this. Your menu should have a question option like this. So please, you're welcome to pop through questions at any time during the presentation. And don't feel that you have to wait till the end, because Adele is never able to wait until the end. He has to always interrupt and ask a question before we get to the end. So please stick up your hand and we'll be more than happy to take your question before we get to the end. And don't forget, we are recording the session and it will be on our website. Look out for it in the newsletter as well, so that if you do have to leave for any reason, you can still catch up. Right, so because we're really into the food industry and we love food safety, we thought we would look at this in bite-sized chunks. So this is not intended to be a training course because we've only got an hour together, but we really wanted to look at some very important highlights and lowlights as we go through the presentation. So I just want to do a bit of a recap because it's important that we're all on the same page when it comes to the intention of this standard and what it is supposed to achieve when it comes to the South African food industry. So I think what's important is you should know, I should have actually asked you, what does HACCP stand for? Because you could have got a prize, like right then and there. The first one to put their hand up could have got a prize. It's too late now. We all know that it stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. Now, why would I bore you with this? Because you know it already. Well, because this is fundamental in understanding why we actually have this standard within South Africa and why it should feature in your knowledge of food safety management system standards. You don't have to implement it necessarily because there's a number of them, but it's knowing about it. Okay, so what is it supposed to do? Well, it's supposed to be a system that identifies, evaluates, and controls hazards that are significant to food safety. Nedeli, that's what it's supposed to do, right? So it's not supposed to be a big file which, you know, you dust off once a year when the auditors come in and you all run around like crazy people. It's not supposed to be that. It's supposed to be a preventive management tool. There is this defined sequence of steps, the 12 stages of Codex, which we all refer back to. It's obviously intended to protect the consumer from harm and, of course, to produce safe food. What do we mean by safe food? It's food that is free from contamination and will not cause harm or illness. Okay, so that's like the foundation of what we've tried to achieve and have been trying to achieve all along. So where does it come from? So this is important, just a little bit of a history lesson quick. And I know that a lot of this is before you guys were even born. So I know this could be a little boring, but it's actually quite important because understanding where it came from helps us to understand where we're going. So it's important. So Dali, ons gaan nou maan toe, né? It was in 1959 by NASA. So I know that was before I was even alive and Daddy was alive. But the important thing is that the need was obviously to ensure that we could prevent any foodborne illness in space, because we all know that Jippo guts at zero gravity is not going to be pretty and it's going to be very difficult, definitely difficult to control. Okay, so the whole idea here was to provide a preventive tool that could ensure safety of food. The public got to hear about it in 1971 when they all came back safely from the moon without having had any foodborne illness. In 1974, the concept of HACCP was adopted into law. Now, this is very important, please, because this is before Codex was even written. It was a legal requirement that was included in the American legislative framework. And so from that perspective, we start to see the formalization of a scientific concept. Codex recommended the use of HACCP initially in the 80s, and then in 1983, further guidance was published in this regard, and the Codex document, which is General Hygiene Principles, has been revised several times and in fact is currently under revision. So the thing that we've had for decades is also about to change, which means all our food safety management system standards are likely to change anyway. Now, the important word in that second last paragraph, Adele, is recommend. Remember, Codex is a group of governments. The intention is to provide guidance documents and standards that can then be used by those member countries.
Is this now the next slide without showing Buzz Lightyear? Because I'm still seeing Buzz.
You still see Buzz. Okay, right. Okay. So now what's important about Codex is that the documents that they put in place are in some cases adopted into law, in other cases are just recommendation documents. They're there for good practice. Each member country must adopt the document. It doesn't mean just because you've written it, it automatically becomes a requirement within your country. Okay, so the intention here is really to facilitate world trade. So the purpose of having a food safety management system that is, or at least recognized internationally, should allow us to trade and is obviously part of the key agreements regarding phytosanitary and sanitary requirements, and of course in terms of the general, the trade agreements. Now, how does this impact on South Africa? Remember, it's a guidance document. So 2003, finally, we included as part of our regulatory framework, although it was not enforced until much later. For a few years, we had Annexure A and Annexure B. Annexure A defining the sectors of the food industry. Annexure B was blank. Until the peanut processes were included on Annexure B, and in 2018, as a result of the Listeriosis outbreak, processed meat and poultry products. So currently, HACCP is a mandatory requirement in all of those, or in those sectors only, and for the rest of us, it is a voluntary requirement unless we have a contract with one of our customers, which then obviously forces us to adopt the standard because of our customer contractual requirement. Now, what's important to bear in mind is that in 2003, the South African government adopted the Codex requirements for HACCP within South Africa. So it said that we had to use a standard that was based on the Codex requirements, and it said in the regulation, as it still does, that the system that is implemented must be audited by a SANS accredited certification body. Now, I'm going to come back to that because this is a fundamental understanding of why we have SANS 10330, because it's about HACCP certification. So it can be a legal requirement, but the department chose not to audit it themselves. In other words, they're not using inspectors to actually go in and assess the compliance to the Codex document. They're requiring the certification structures within South Africa to do this on their behalf. The EHP would come in and would look at the certificate that has been issued to you against the South African standard, not against Regulation 908. Now, this is very important because in order for us to comply with the regulation, we have to be audited by a SANS accredited certification company. That means two things. First of all, we have to have a national or international standard that is publicly available for a certification body to use in the auditing process. The second is we need to have an auditing company, and that auditing company has to be accredited by SANS. So in order to fulfill both of those requirements, we need to make sure that we have both structures in place. Hence, we needed a South African standard for this process to be conducted. Now, of course, it's not the only scheme, and over time, we've had to develop these auditing schemes because Codex HACCP itself, the document itself, is not an auditable standard. Okay, so you can see from this list that all over the world, there have been a range of certification schemes. Depending on where you were, there are different organizations that implemented a certification program, an independent audit of your HACCP system in order to give you a certificate that you could then use for your customers and for international trade. Please bear in mind that none of these audits are done against the specific codex document. They, in fact, have adopted that document either in a legal requirement or they've included it within a national standard or, in some cases, a private standard, such as the BRC. So 10330 was originally called a code of practice. That's what we used to call them until the Standards Act was amended. It is a voluntary standard, so that's important to bear in mind. All South African standards are voluntary unless they are included within a legal requirement, unless they're brought into the legal framework. They are voluntary standards. The standard itself requires us to comply with all legislation, and initially there was a recommendation to comply with SANS 10049 within the first version. This has changed. Now it is a shall, and we'll talk about that later. So another quick history lesson. In the original version of the document that we're talking about was published in 1999. Then it was called SABS 0330, and it really covered the requirements of Codex plus a few additional requirements. It was worked on and republished in 2006, or revised and published as a SANS standard in 2006. And then there was a bit of a oopsie, and it had to be republished with a correction in 2007. It is now being revised for the next time, and as I said, it took a long time for this document to come together, and I won't bore you with the details, but all I can say is that it took the technical committee a long time to come to consensus about some issues which related to whether the document should even exist and whether it is legally able to exist given the World Trade Organization. And as I said, I won't bore you with the details. Now, what's important about this, the triangle that I'm showing you, you should be very familiar with this, because when we start a food safety management system, we should always start with regulation. So I've put regulation 962 because that was really the regulation that we had to comply with when the first SANS document was published. We now have to comply with regulation 638, but that's the baseline for your food safety management system. On top of that, Dali, you know that one very well because obviously you come from your days as an environmental health practitioner. The next level is 10049 in the South African framework. We have our own national standard for prerequisite programs. So you may refer to the ISO 22000 series. You may not even be aware that we have our own national standard. I have to say, I think it's a very good document. You should look at it. It was revised in 2019 for the last time, and it's a very good basis for prerequisite programs. And then when it comes to HACCP, we have our own national standard being 10330. So for all intents and purposes, South Africa has its own self-contained food safety management system pyramid. If you looked at the ISO documents, you obviously would have the ISO technical standards as the second level, and then ISO 22000 as the HACCP component. For those of you that are in the FSSC space, you know that you then have to consider other requirements. It's more than just the HACCP component. Now, this is.
I want to stop you just here and ask. I think it would. You know, you were going to happen sometime. Hey, so now you can at least take a sip of coffee. What I want to ask is, you know, we get so many people asking, especially if it's a new business. So it's a new business, they're just starting, whatever, and they never know where to go or what to go for. Now, for someone listening now, that this can be very overwhelming in terms of, I mean, the basic, you know, getting your certificate of acceptability, that's one thing. But now wanting to go into retail, and now the retailers have their requirements and things like that. So what is the next step? So with all of this and that building blocks, are you building up to explaining to people basically how to climb this ladder to get to the top? Okay. Awesome.
Absolutely. But I think it is a very important point, because many of the people that we chat to, you know, during the week are wanting to supply the retail sector, but they don't understand that there is a foundation that they have to build first in order to achieve it. So this slide is really to try and show you the global markets capacity building program of the GFSI, which has been adopted by South African retailers as the progression in order to build your food safety management system. So I think everybody understands that you don't go from 0 to hero immediately. It takes a while, and for smaller businesses, often it's a capacity and a capital issue. We can't just comply with those requirements. So when they put the FSI process in place and the GFSI process in place, you can see that they allowed for a basic level, an intermediate level, and then finally the GFSI benchmark level. So where does this 10330 fit in this progression? So bear in mind, people, you know, you're not even supposed to sell Cook Sisters or samosas from your house if you haven't got a COA. Am I right, Deli?
Absolutely. And we know that's a challenge to apply for it and know where to apply for it, but unfortunately, that's the basis where we all have to start.
Right, so that is the current legal basis, and you can't even approach the retail sector if you do not have a valid COA in place. You wouldn't be able to get a HACCP certificate if you didn't have a COA. You should never be able to do that, okay? Because the whole point is that the voluntary systems must support the, must have as their foundation the basic legal requirements. What the GFSI then did was, from the full set of things, if you had to take the big picture, what are the minimum requirements that we would expect of an SMME when we're looking at taking on board the risk of their products? So the basic level of certification against the GFSI or FSI capacity building program in South Africa is really looking at the prerequisite programs. And so here, a good starting point would be to look at SANS 10049 because it defines what those PRPs should be. The basic level checklist gives you some indication of what the auditor would be looking for, what you should have in place. But I really do feel that 10049 helps to fill in the blanks in that regard. Now, what's important to understand from a HACCP point of view, and the purpose of the document we're discussing today, is that there is a need for a hazard analysis even at basic level. Now, Dali, if you are in an abattoir in South Africa, the Meat Safety Act requires the same. You even have to have a hazard analysis in the abattoir, even though you don't need HACCP. Why? Well, it's about knowing what could go wrong and then having a preventive measure in place to ensure that it doesn't go wrong. And so we need to appreciate that many prerequisite programs are just that. Why do we have a pest control system, Dali?
Yeah, I think that's often why I feel that, you know, the science and the terminology makes the smaller people so scared. You know, they hear this HACCP thing, but exactly like you're saying, why do you have pest control? Why are you trying to make sure that there's no pests present? Because of, you know, the illnesses they've got that can be transmitted over, or cross-contamination can happen. And I think that's what the smaller people must remember. Yes, it's all these words, HACCP, TACCP, VACCP, but the logic behind it is, why are you doing something, or why are you implement something to do what for your end product, to safeguard it against what? So yeah, the PRPs, like you say, is the building blocks at the bottom, and even 638 are requiring you to have those things. So it's to ask yourself the question before you spend the money to do that, is it definitely going to make sure that whatever that a pest or glass or whatever, not going to get into your product, are you doing it in the right way? So yeah, it's you know, I think I often say to the smaller people, don't let the legislation and the words and those type of things bog you down that you think, oh, this is so ingewikkeld. Meantime, it's just what you said now. Why are you doing these things?
Yeah, right. So it's all about hazard analysis. And so I mean, even at a basic level, for an SMME, you still have to do a hazard analysis for the basic level of the global markets capacity building program. A small business owner must still understand what could go wrong and must understand the need for a control measure. The intermediate level requires us to now start formalizing this into a HACCP system. In other words, a structured risk assessment process with evidence of implementation and due diligence. And this is where 10330 comes in. Having been part of the technical committee from the very beginning of the revision from the 1999 version, it was a conscious decision to try and provide a document that would allow smaller companies or even companies entering food safety management systems and the ability to work towards what would be internationally recognized. Our local market has certain requirements, and how do we make sure that we equip and enable companies to implement HACCP in a stepwise approach? In 2006, when this document was revised, it was a conscious decision of the committee to provide and to continue to have this standard in order to enable. Now, bear in mind that in 2006, ISO 22000 had already been in publication for a year. So we could have said as a committee at that point, forget this, we're not going to even bother with our own national standard. Let's just adopt the international standard and let's leave our national standard. But the committee at that point felt that it was too big a jump for many companies and it was necessary to have a stepping stone. When we started to revise this document in about 2010, the committee agreed again that this was a necessary document to enable companies to make a stepwise transition when it comes to the development of a food safety management system. And that's why it's been republished in 2020, to ensure that we can build capacity and take this in a way that allows companies to move towards a GFSI benchmark standard, because as we know, those standards don't just look at HACCP requirements, they have other requirements that ensure the safety of food. Food fraud and having considering the vulnerabilities of your product to food fraud can have food safety implications. Food defense definitely has food safety implications because it is the malicious and intentional tampering of your product that could harm your consumer. So when we look at HACCP and how it fits in, you can understand that what we're doing in 10330 is a component of a food safety management system, but it definitely doesn't give you the full cover that the GFSI standards are intended to provide. And as we've developed, so these standards have become more and more encompassing to truly give you a food safety management system that considers all aspects that could impact on the safety of your product. So when we wrote 10330, it was Codex HACCP plus additional requirements. Nowhere in Codex do you find the need to do a management review. Nowhere in Codex do you find the need to do internal audits. Now that's a weakness within the technical document because it doesn't give us any indication of the fact that we need to actually continually maintain and manage our food safety management system. The 12 principles are great in terms of a methodology, but how will we keep this thing alive? How will we make sure that it becomes part of our business? How do we make sure it's implemented? How do we make sure it's improved and kept up to date?
And Lynn, sorry, I want to interrupt you then. I think that's such an important point that you're making. That whole part of your food system is alive. It's an active thing. It's an everyday thing. It's not, I want to go for certification and I'm just doing it for audits. It has to be what you do every day, what you enjoy, and everybody that's involved needs to make sure that that is, transmitted through to everybody, that, it's an everyday thing.
Right. So what you're referring to, I think, Dali, is the importance of a food safety culture. And what's interesting is it's not mentioned anywhere in 10330, and everyone's seeing that as like the next step. But what you're saying, which is so correct, is you already have a food safety culture. It's either one of minimum compliance, in other words, you tick all the boxes and rush around before the audit, or it's one of those where you say, we are doing this for the right reasons and it's part and parcel of our business, and it's what makes us successful. So yeah, perhaps, we need to redraw that triangle to say, before you even decide to make a cook sister, you have to have the right thinking about ensuring that it's for the right reasons, or that you're doing food safety for the right reasons. Very good point. Okay, so what I'm saying about the new version is that it's now HACCP, Codex HACCP, plus some more stuff. Okay, so the standard has definitely increased in terms of requirements, and even more specific requirements have now been included, where lots of I's have been dotted and lots of T's have been crossed. Okay, so the highlights package, people, this is what you came for. Okay, so what are my observations about the standard? Well, the first thing is, if you do have an ISO 22000 system in place, you will find that the numbering of the 2020 version of the 10330 does not align to the high-level structure of ISO. So they have tried in some places, but there are 10 requirements, but it does not fit into the high-level structure, unfortunately. But you should never number your documents according to an ISO standard anyway, but just so that you know, they did not do that. It came way too far into the development of the standard, and as I say, the SABS nearly canned the project because it was taking so long. So there are these sections of the standard: documentation requirements, management responsibility, resources, corrective action, food safety measurement, preliminary steps, obviously to the implementation of HACCP, and then the application of the HACCP principles, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail. There's some very specific things, Dali, Gamut, or plates, because these are the things that could become an audit issue, because you think you've got FSSC 22000, and so this should be a walk in the park if you want to get a 10330 certificate. It should be, however, please take note of some of the specific requirements that are defined in the standard. Your documents have to be kept for a minimum of a year. It actually says that in the standard, and it doesn't say which documents, it says documents. So by implication, that means all documents that are involved with food safety should be kept for a year. Now, you're probably doing that already, but just be careful. 22,000 doesn't say anything like this. It says you define the retention period, but now this is very specific. Obviously, it also does link to legal requirements, but just to keep notes of this. The other thing is, if you threw out all your procedures, because ISO 22000, the 2018 version no longer uses the word documented procedures, you better find them in file 13, because 10330 still uses the word documented procedure. Now, again, you might say, but that's crazy. Why are we doing this? Well, for smaller businesses that have never had anything documented, it's important to define the fact that certain things should be documented. And as you become more, adept at this process, well, maybe then a procedure doesn't necessarily define compliance. And of course, remember, just having the procedure doesn't mean you comply. It means you have to still implement the procedure. But the term documented procedure is still used within 10330 2020. We were discussing this one earlier, Dali, because the standard says that someone should sign records to indicate the verification of those records. It also makes the point, and I think this is something that we were chatting about earlier, that this person should be suitably qualified. How would we know that this person is suitably qualified? Well, it's up to the company to define. There is a level of interpretation, but I think what's important here is that you can't mark your own exam paper. That's the principle. So if I'm the person who fills in the cleaning checklist, someone else should check my work to make sure that if there are any non-conformances, that we take action, or if something is not done in the correct way, that we take action. So that means if you're designing a form, how many signatures on the form, Deli?
2.
2. Okay, 2 in all cases, because this is a SANS requirement. Okay.
And not done in the office a week later.
Yes.
Actually done on the
Remember, I'm thinking of all those audits we did in that big catering company. Do you remember how we caught them quickly filling in the form? Shame. I always felt a bit sorry for them, but I'm sure you know what that means. In my opinion, it's a little bit light on management responsibilities. And Del, it's a bit open to interpretation, because they need to demonstrate their commitment, but how? So if you compare it to ISO 22000 now, 22000 has become quite heavy on the leadership side, and rightly so, with a whole list of specific requirements. Whereas in this case, it's quite light. You know, I think there's 3 lines about management's responsibility, and not a lot of, it is very open to interpretation. The one thing we must note is an annual management review. Now, this is normally expected. Normally, the certification body will expect you to have an annual management review. In this case, it's stated. It's actually stated that it's an annual management review. The one thing I do like, Deli, is they haven't taken out the commitment to give the resources in writing. So top management must provide the budget, and they have to provide the budget in writing, which is a good thing, because sometimes they can say they commit to the resources, but then they can't, or they don't. So this, I think, is stronger even than ISO 22000, you know, is the way that it states it there. There is a food safety representative. So now, within ISO 22000, we have the food safety team leader, and that person obviously has a role to play. What's good about this is that they must be a member of management. So careful here. SANS actually defines that this person must be a member of management. So that means they must have manager after their name. So if they are the food safety manager, they can't just be the food safety coordinator. Now, this is important, and we had long discussions about it, because it is about the right level of authority and being able to execute work through a team of people. The thing I don't like is that the food safety rep can appoint the team. In fact, they must appoint the team. I think ideally it should come from a bit higher, because, you know, just from a management structure, it's better if the boss's boss, you know, appoints us as opposed to a colleague appointing us. I think it could be a problem from an organizational perspective. You won't find anything in the standard about external communication, which for me is a problem, because talking to our customers and suppliers about food safety is critical in understanding their requirements and our requirements. Nothing about external communication, nothing about having to ensure that all employees have got an awareness of food safety. PRPs must be in place before HACCP implementation, and this is a formal thing. Huh? I like that, because it means there's a staged approach. PRPs, then we move to HACCP. And it also now says we shall use 10330. Del, it's not a maybe anymore. We have to use 10330 for, I beg your pardon, 10049 for our PRPs, or an equivalent international standard. So it's not a maybe, it's a shall requirement, which is very good. Another one, just
shall equals will.
There we go. Shall equals will equals must equals, yes, sal het doen. I'm not sure if you know any other languages, but it's you have to do it at the end of the day. The other thing that you have to do is annual refresher training. So it actually states this within the standard that there must be annual refresher training. Muku, we're going to come to your questions, and I think the short answer is yes. And there may be a reason for it. The answer may also be no. It will not depend so much on your choice of standard. It's going to depend on who your certification body is. So I'm going to come back.
Maybe just tell the other delegates what her question is.
Oh, sorry, Muku, I apologize for that. Muku wanted to understand from us whether we still need to, if an organization has ISO 22000, does this mean that SANS 330 still has to be implemented, especially for the regulated products? I'm going to come back to it. The short answer could be yes. If you are using a certification body that is not SANS accredited for ISO 22000, then you will have to engage with a SANS accredited certification body for 10330. So what has happened is many of the certification bodies, such as CPG, for example, have applied for SANS accreditation. It means they hold dual accreditation, SANS as well as SANS, which is not ideal and not the way that it's supposed to be in the bigger scheme of things. However, Regulation 908 is very clear. The only certificate that will be accepted in those regulated sectors is one that is issued by a SANS accredited certification body. The Department of Health have been engaged on several levels. They will not change this requirement. It is a mandatory requirement. Okay, so we'll come back to it at the end of the presentation, but good question, Muku, and I'm sure lots of people wanted to know the same, ask the same question. Okay, whoops, sorry, I've lost my place on my presentation. Let me just...
Linda, okay. we running into overtime a little bit, so either we can...
talk faster?
Yes, yeah, that's what I wanted to say. We're in any event going to give the slides to the people that's attended. So
you have to drop off, not to worry, you'll get the slides as well as some of the handouts that we're going to be talking about soon. Sorry, I'm having the same problem I had yesterday in my webinar. All right. Okay. All right.
We just love the topic so much, and I mean, there's so much to say.
Yes, no, sorry, guys. I don't mean to talk too much. Just tell me to shut up if you've had enough. Okay, a couple of other important things about this standard. This standard says you have to have defined criteria for selecting your team. So you can't just go eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Sorry, you lot are in the team. You actually have to justify why people are in the team. They have to accept their appointment in writing. It doesn't say it in ISO 22000, but I would expect it as an auditor. It is a formal assignment. The other nice thing about 10330 is there must be rules for the team. In other words, how do we conduct ourselves? How often do we have meetings? What do we do if we don't agree? And I have to say it's been in since the 2006 version, and I'm glad they left it in because it definitely helps a company to create structure within the process of implementing the HACCP system. There must be a HACCP review procedure, and in this procedure, if nothing changes, you must at least review your HACCP system once a year. The product description has been changed to be very descriptive, and I like this because it helps us to understand exactly what the terminology means. It's an improvement. I think it's really great. There's some copy and paste from ISO 22000. Yeah, it's definitely there. The approval of the flow diagram and those kinds of things, those paragraphs have literally been copied and pasted. But in this case, the flow diagram must actually be signed by the team. The standard uses those words. So it can't just be a decision. In the food safety team meetings, you actually have to show the signature on the diagram. I like the floor plan. It's also included 922, but I like the way that they put the floor plan requirement. The acceptable level of the hazard is now included. It's a copy and paste. Just unfortunately, no link to how this works for the hazard assessment in terms of, the identifying significant hazards in relation to the acceptable level. The standard uses this phrase, a combination of control measures. So you can see that it is alluding to what ISO 22000 says about CCPs and OPRPs. It unfortunately only uses this phrase once, and it doesn't explain how to use, or rather how to manage these control measures. The focus of the standard then moves purely to the CCPs, where we determine which step is a CCP. We still use the decision tree. The codex decision tree is still given as an annex, and It doesn't say anything else about the other steps, other than they must be controlled by appropriate control measures, or the other hazards should be other significant hazards must be controlled by appropriate control measures, but it doesn't give us any more indication as to what we're supposed to do there. The focus then moves to CCPs, critical limits for CCPs, monitoring and validation only of CCPs. So from that perspective, it's easier, I suppose, to implement because there's less validation requirements. And that's the end of the standard, people. So I almost felt like when I got to the end, it's like, where's the rest? Because there's a lot of the detail in ISO 22000, which is definitely not covered by the standard. But if you go back to my little picture, you'll understand why. It's because it's intended to provide a progression for a smaller company entering into food safety for the very first time. Okay, so Daddy, you've got some questions before we open the floor.
Yes, so there's just one that I wanted to ask is in terms of, say now for instance, I had the old 10330, so I need now to transition or get to where I comply with this one. Is there a process? Is there some guidance of indicating how and where I can do this?
Yeah, so SANS issued a document where they actually have provided for 2 years, a 2-year transition period. It's normally 3, so just be aware of that. It's normally a 3-year transition period. This is an exception to that, and the reason for that is because the changes were not considered to be that material or from the previous version, and so only a 2-year period is given, and that is from September of last year. So that's important to bear in mind.
Okay. Is there any questions from the floor? Is there anybody that would like, if you raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can ask your question and see to it that we can answer it. Lynn, you've mentioned that what we're going to do is we will send a comparison PDF document to everybody that's attended today, right. For them also just for guidance.
Absolutely. So Jess has put together a really great comparison document, word for word, paragraph by paragraph. So we're going to be sending that through to you. What I'll also do is we'll send through to you the link from Food Focus, where we actually have the official press release from SANS with regards to this 2-year transition period. So we will definitely do that. Jess, go ahead. I've unmuted you, so you can unmute yourself on your side.
Promise. Good morning, Linda and Adele. How are you guys?
Good, thanks.
Awesome. Nice to hear your voice, please.
So my question is probably more from the practical side, and it's in terms of how would one go about finding the SANS document if you are a small business and the other documents that you'd have to be aware of in association with SANS, and then how would you know when they update these documents, because it's not exactly something that turns up on the news. So yes.
Well, yeah, we tried to call it the news on Food Focus, but we're not like ENCA just yet. You know, someone who wants to give us a lot of money will definitely go that big, but at the moment we're not. Good question, Jess, because at the end of the day, the SABS does operate a little bit like the government. So there is a legal requirement in South Africa that any national standard, any law must be in the public domain. But what that means to the government is if it's published on the government website in a government gazette, which is on a website that we can all see, that's as far as they need to go. I think in some cases they may issue a press release, which is what SANS did do. But of course, you've got to make sure you're reading the right news, and that's obviously where we do try to fill the gap because we want to make industry aware of what's changing. Right. So how do I find an SABS standard? Well, the first thing you need to understand, these documents are protected by copyright, which means you have to buy them. So you have to buy them from the SABS. And I'll include the link for you. They have an online store, and when you buy, you can use a credit card. You can immediately download the document, but it is copyright protected. And so that's important to note. It's not free, unfortunately. It is, unfortunately, a document that is subject to fees. Now, within the document itself, yes, so within the document...
Sorry, and by the copyright, it means unfortunately, because when you buy it from them at the bottom, they will indicate who bought it from them. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, so you can see at the top in big red letters, it says that it belongs to me and it's subject to copyright. And every time you print it, it obviously prints that out. Now, Jess, your question relating to, well, what else must I comply with? The way they structure the standards is that there is always a section within an SABS standard called normative references. And under that paragraph, it's paragraph 2, it actually lists the other standards that you should, or that are referenced within this document that you must read in conjunction with the standard. So the 10049 that I mentioned, it's actually listed, and it's listed in several places in the document. So if you're reading the HACCP standard for the first time, it will keep prompting you to look at 10049. Also, if you go on a proper training course, the training company should definitely take you through these processes. So I would never suggest to a company to try this alone if they've never done it before and they're not employing you, someone who's coming in with technical expertise. Rather go on a good training course to at least get some guidance before you start this, on your own. Okay, good questions, Jess. Muku, we've got another question. Let's hear from you. I'm going to unmute you.
It seems like she's self-muted. Just unmute yourself,
Yeah,
Muku.
unmute yourself, Muku. We got you. Not to worry. Okie dokes. Right. Mapule, thank you for your question. Yes, definitely. I know you missed the first part, but don't stress. There is a recording. It will go out as well as the presentation. Okay, so you won't miss out any of the highlights packages from that perspective. Okay, so let's come back to Muku's question about the issue in relation to having to comply with this standard, even though you have, FSSC 22000. Okay. So what's important to bear in mind is that the department. Muku, do you want to chat to us? Because you're in this situation. Hey, you having to comply with both. Go for it. Talk to us.
Okay. Actually, Linda. Good morning, Linda and Adele.
Hello.
Actually. Remember, I work for SANS.
You work for SANS, so you know how this works. In fact, you should be telling me how this works, Muku.
No, not we don't know anything, but everything. But we do. That's why I always join this, because this is where we get all the pointers over and above all the trainings that we get. But this is the kind of question that we always get all the time. If they certify, if they are already FSSC, and you know how certification bodies will always go from HACCP, and then they'll go to ISO 22 and FSSC, and then they come back to SANS. Why do we have to be accredited for this, yet we already have others? That is one question, and that's what I also wanted to understand. But over and above that, I wanted to add on to your comment that the document that is that shows the transition, it's actually published on the SANS website free of charge without request. It's called the TR08, and it can be accessed from the SANS website to find everything about transitions and what would be expected out of certification bodies. Even though we are not working directly with the facilities organizations, but we are looking at certification bodies, but the facilities and organizations would also be very important for them to access those documents, because it will help to find out what we are looking at when we're going to go for witnesses and for assessments of those certification bodies as well. Absolutely. So, but the question still stays. I still need to understand as well.
No, absolutely. Okay, so
a lot of times.
Perfect. So everybody, just so that you understand, so I mean, Muku's working for SANS. Okay, so SANS are the auditors of the auditors. Am I right, Muku?
Yes, definitely.
Right. Okay. So the accreditation body goes in to ensure that the certification body is operating in accordance with standards that are published and are applicable to those auditing companies. Okay. Now, Muko, I think the question is interesting, because what you mentioned just now in terms of the progression, the question is, you said they have HACCP, then they go for FSSC 22000, now they have to come back to 10330. The question I have to ask is, how did they get HACCP, or what standard did they use to get HACCP initially?
Most of the certificate, let's start with the certification bodies. Certification bodies would be accredited with either ISO 22000 or accredited for FSSC 22000. And basically, those would be certification bodies that have been accredited with foreign, if I may call that, foreign accreditation bodies. As long as even though they are our peers, but certification bodies will come back, they don't see the need to be accredited for SANS 10330 because they already have this ISO and the FSSC, and HACCP is a component of that, without actually understanding that SANS 10330 might have other clauses that are not exactly the same as ISO 22000. And as well, we always say there are also SANS 10330 will also go with some regulations for other sectors, or the other sectors like we are talking about the COA right now, or there will be meat and peanut butter and all those things.
Right. So I think the point that you're making there is critical, because the SANS cannot accredit a certification body to audit against a regulation, can they?
No, they don't. They won't.
So even though we have regulation 908, no certification body can be accredited to audit against 908.
No.
Can a certification body be accredited to audit against the codex document?
No.
Right. So that's why we have had to write 10330, because we can't, no accredited certification body can give a certificate against either legislation or that the codex document. We need to have a national or an international standard. And so from the perspective of moving forward, the department have said that they will accept an FSSC 22000 certificate instead of a SANS 10330 certificate, provided the certification body is SANS accredited. So coming back to the work that you do when it comes to accrediting companies, the department don't necessarily want to see a 10330 certificate. They are happy to accept the FSSC certificate, but only if it's issued by a company that you have audited. And for many certification bodies, that's been the problem. Because like you said, they're accredited with a foreign accreditation company. Why must they now be accredited with yourself? Because the law says so. And there isn't any other explanation other than the law says so. So they don't the company doesn't have to implement both standards, but they must make sure that the certification body carries dual accreditation if it is a foreign certification body. Is that clear?
Okay, that is also clear, because I thought it would also be clear for the organizations or the facility representatives that are here, because I think the questions always come from them to the certification bodies, and then they will come to us, and then we don't get to be able to explain to the facilities or the production areas rather than explaining to the certification body.
Absolutely, no, absolutely. So that's the thing. The law is about the accreditation. It's not about the choice of standards. I think for the company, it's about the choice of standards. So the question is so which one should I aim for? There could be confusion. Remember, from both perspectives, thanks, Muko. Jess has also raised a question now. So thank you for your comments, and it's really great to have SANS as part of this discussion. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. So Last question, and then we're going to say goodbye. What should I aim for? Well, Jess, I think the question relates to what do your customers want? And
Yeah.
I'm being perfectly frank with you now, because at the end of the day, you know, I think the bottom line is we want safe food. Which food safety management system is the most robust when it comes to requirements for food safety? I think if you look at ISO 22000, they've tried to close further loopholes in the 2018 version. In other words, further areas where there was opportunities for interpretation. So that's a good thing. So it is, in my opinion, a very stringent standard when it comes to the application of the HACCP principles. It is very prescriptive in that regard. However, the choice is really up to a company, and it often relates to the requirements from a customer. So when you make the choice, think about the commercial implications of your choice. Having said that, you could have none of these requirements in place and have a very safe product. What I mean by that in closing, ladies and gentlemen, is just because you have SANS 10330 or just because you have FSSC 22000, that doesn't mean your products are always safe. It's never a fail-safe system. It relies on human beings doing the right things every day. It does expect more due diligence, but I think at the end of the day, the certificate on the wall doesn't necessarily mean our products are always safe. Like Adele said, food safety is a behavioral issue, and it's something that we should be doing every single day, every minute of the day when no one's watching, regardless of who the certification body is, which standard we're using, and which companies we're supplying. So hopefully that just reminds you that it's not about the standard, not about the audit, but it's about doing the right thing because it's just the right thing to do.
Yeah, and it's your name, and it's your product, and it's your life. So therefore, but I really appreciate the questions that we got, and I appreciate everybody that stayed online, and we hope that we did manage to answer questions that you had. Like Linda said, we're going to send through to you that document that was drawn up with Jess that helped us with that, and we will send that through to you. And we will also, the document that they talk about the helping with the transition that Muku spoke about, we will also give you a link to that. And yeah, it's important for us that you reach out to us and give us topics on our forum that you would like us to deal with in this manner. And like Linda always says, we don't necessarily know everything, but hopefully we know someone somewhere that will help us to answer all your questions. And I want to say thank you for your time, and over to you, Lynn.
Thanks so much, Dilly. Okie dokes, everyone get a copy of 10330. It is worth reading. I think it's been quite well written. You'll see the language is quite plain, which I think really helps when it comes to understanding some of the fundamentals, especially if you're starting on the formal HACCP implementation within your company. And if you would like to join us for our next food safety fundamentals, which is going to be on the 3rd of March, am I right, Del?
Yep,
We will be chatting about how do I become a food safety auditor. We've had lots and lots of requests to have this conversation. So we're going to do something a little different. We're going to be bringing in a panel of auditors, and Adele and I will be auditing the auditors to find out how did they get to where they are now, and what would they do, what would they not do again. So please come with all your questions, because I'm sure they would love to hear from you too. Enjoy your Friday. Have a good weekend. It was great being with you, and we hope to see you next time. Take care.
God bless everybody. Enjoy. Bye.